This episode is the second of a two-part conversation on hiring ethical employees. Part 1 of this question of ethics conversation, held January 26, 2023, is available on the Ethics Subcommittee webpage, which is part of the NACM website.
Today, I think we're going to start with accountability, and there may be some overlap with the last month's discussion, but I thought it'd be good to start here to make sure we cover it. So here's the first one. Describe a situation in which you took responsibility for a mistake you made. What were the consequences to you for doing so? What do you all think of question and asking it in an interview? Or whether it's valid, or whether or not you might even get a reasonable response, because that was a big thing in Lawrence was, well, if you ask this kind of a question, can you really expect an honest answer, was a big topic that we talked about. So what do you think about this one?
I love this question. I think that it provides a plethora of insight. Namely, I mean, if somebody sits across from me and says, I've never made a mistake, like, that's not working for me. But I would much rather somebody explain, a genuine mistake was made. And I think that as a characteristic of a leader or a future leader, that they would be willing to accept that responsibility for whatever X would be. Maybe I would add something, tell me about time you made a mistake and what were the consequences of, and I don't want to know anything criminal, like maybe specify it like at work. And then maybe expand on that, like what were the consequences? What did you learn from it? What would you have done differently? Those kinds of things, because I think that would display their ability to accept responsibility. I think that would display their ability to then, like, okay, a mistake was made, there were consequences, but did you go back and then evaluate where the mistake took place? So I think this could tell you a lot. I like this one.
It's also valuable to see if they take personal responsibility, or if they find someone else to blame for their mistake or share the blame. I'm really looking for someone who totally owns a mistake and tells me how they resolved it. So I think that's very valuable, just to see what even mistake they choose to present to you.
Well, I think we have to keep in mind that, again, job interviews are not therapy sessions. So you are going to carefully choose what instance or example you're going to use in your life to describe taking responsibility for a mistake. You may or probably wouldn't hear the worst possible situation the candidate has ever been involved in, but something where the candidate came out at least looking pretty good. I would throw the question back to all of you. Would you hire or continue to seriously consider a candidate who said, I made a serious mistake and I owned up to it, my responsibility, but I was terminated for that? Would you continue to consider that person for your court?
That might depend upon what the mistake and what the error was. I mean, if the mistake was stealing money from the court, then I think I would say, sure,
Yeah.
It was justified to fire him. On the other hand, if it may be something which another employer might consider to be serious, but I wouldn't in my environment. Yeah.
If a judge got very angry with you for something that you did, I mean, a fairly honest mistake, and asked for your termination and got it, would you, as a court administrator, continue to keep that person high up on the consideration list?
I think there's kind of some nuance to it, is whatever they did, regardless of if they are copying to it or not, was the action that they did a violation of our ethical code of conduct in general? Did it overall impugn the dignity of the court? Those are questions that would be asked. But yeah, I think depending upon what it was, I would still consider that.
We've talked about responsibility, and the second question actually here deals right with responsibility. So we have you ever taken responsibility for an error another team member made? Tell me about it. And this get back to what Stacy and I think first talked about is okay, particularly if you're in a team environment, you're supposed to all be responsible together for things that happen, so this one kind of gets at the heart of that. So what do you think of broadening it out a little bit more? So it may not be your own personal mistake, but it's in your team. So I think we talked about that somewhat. But it's just nuances of accountability and responsibility. And there's a third question, and this is an interesting one. And again, I'm taking in the first session, I talked about how these characteristics that are used here, I've lifted out in these questions out of a book called The Good Ones by Bruce Weinstein, Crucial Qualities of Character Employees. And so he has this question in there, and I wanted to add it in here to see what you think about just this kind of a broad, open-ended question in this. And
I like this one also.
good. Why?
Well, because I think if you described me if somebody described me or asked me to describe my typical working day, I think that would be very difficult as they vary. Your days vary. But I think when you ask someone to talk about their typical working day, you get a body language that says a lot, that sometimes is more meaningful than what is potentially coming out of their mouth. So if you hear people using words like, well, during my typical day, I get to interact with the public all day, I think that sends a certain message. Or if you get the body language that they're smiling when they're talking about what they do within a day. I think the ability to even articulate what you do in a day is important. So I think this one is a good one.
I think that one thing that Mr. Weinstein talks about in his book is that if the person answers in a way which is all about me, I do this, I do this, I do this, that tells you one thing. But if they also have more of an emphasis on, I did this for the court, or I did this to meet the expectations of, my employer, we had these goals, and so that's why I did these things, or whatever, it shows much more of a sense of being part of the organization and being accountable. And it isn't just, focusing on just the task list that may be in front of you or whatever. So that was the sort of a point that he made in the book that I thought I'd share. Here is what could be the fun part of the session, and that is I asked ChatGPT, the AI-based chatbot, to answer this question. What question should I ask in a job interview to hire an ethical employee? So let's walk through what the answer is, and then let's talk about the chatbot did suggest 5 questions. And so we're going to get to the 5 questions here pretty shortly. So this is pretty interesting. All right. So this is the text you have here is ChatGPT's initial part of the answer. There are several questions that you can ask in a job interview to determine if a candidate is ethical and will be a good fit for your company. Here are a few examples. All right, here are the first 2. So let's talk about the first one. Can you give an example of a time when you had to make an ethical decision in your previous work experience? How did you handle the situation? That's pretty on point. What do you think of that question?
Well, just having the person applying define what they think is ethical might be interesting. I mean, it's a little open-ended there. What do they think an ethical decision even means?
Right. And that gets to the second question. Is how do I'm asking an employee or an applicant in an interview, how do you define ethical behavior? And how do you ensure that you are acting ethically in the workplace? I mean, this is really putting the meat on the table here. And so, does the person understand what ethics is about? If they have no understanding what ethics are, they're going to have a hard time answering that question, and I guess that might tell you something about the applicant and whether they're a good fit, and when you're trying to hire an ethical person. So these 2 questions. Any other comments?
This almost, I kind of feel like I'm getting 2 things that are running through my mind. Number one is the question of where do you see yourself in 5 years? And the second part that I'm getting is these almost seem kind of like that an applicant would feel like these are trick questions. I'm just kind of getting that vibe, because I think for one to define ethical behavior, it's almost like I feel like we're almost asking for those standard responses. ethically, I'm gonna be honest, I'm gonna be on time, world peace. All of these like feel good answers that that people tend to give in interviews, and you're looking to get deeper. But defining ethical behavior is a broad question. But I could see where an applicant wouldn't want to say, can you like narrow that down for me? I don't know. I have mixed feelings about these two. I'm not sure.
One thing that hits me about these questions is there's an old adage that you can learn as much from the question that's being asked than the answer that is being given. And if I was a candidate and I was asked these sorts of questions in a job interview, my first question is, what is going on at this court that they keep asking about this stuff? Was there some huge scandal in the court that is driving them to have to ask stuff about this? And do I want to work for a place that's had this huge scandal? I mean, really? And again, I think we go back to, this is not a therapy session. So a pretty crafty candidate is probably going to pick out something like, well, here's an actual instance. A court administrator is in charge of probate. And so a lot of money is passed by the court administrator's desk that goes into escrow for probate accounts. And one day, a check was written out for $10 million to the court administrator, not to the court. It was a clerical error. Okay, did you make an ethical decision? Yes, I made the ethical decision to continue to take this to the bank and to put it in the court's escrow account and not try and cash it and go to Argentina. So, but for a whole host of reasons, I don't think that was a very difficult ethical decision that had to be made. I mean, it makes for a really good story. How far would you get before somebody would figure out the error and track you down, which would probably be more practical than ethical. But I mean, it would make for a good story in a job interview.
I think that when I look at these questions, people aren't, a lot of times in our experience anyway, a lot of people that come into the court have limited knowledge of what our tasks are, what really makes up the job that we do, other than what they see on the court portion of SVU or night court or some other show similar. So when I think about these things, I want it to be able to be relatable across the board, because a lot of times they're not going to be able to give you an example of a court scenario. So you kind of have to make these things fit across the board rather than focused on specific court decisions, because I think, or court questions, because I think that people just really don't, the general public just does not understand what goes on outside of just the individual sitting on the dais. But trying to relate these things, I think, is somewhat challenging. But I'm still, the jury is still out on these two for me.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, Peter and Courtney, and I think those are really good comments, especially putting somebody on the spot to define ethical behavior when they're coming from the outside of our work environment or never worked in the courts before could be a really challenging thing for them to do. It reminded me of the discussion we had again back in the last month, where how do you hire people? Well, one thing you do is you make sure your job descriptions and recruiting materials and such that somebody should be responding to in applying for the job describe how you expect certain kinds of behavior, that you expect ethical behavior. And you might even have before the interview that you provide materials to people about what are the job duties typically like, and even a copy of the code of conduct, so that they are familiar with those things before they go into the interview, so that when they get in the interview, they have been prepped with some knowledge at least, so they can more fairly answer these kinds of questions. Personally, I don't think I would ask number 2, because I think it does put people on the spot. I like number 1 to some extent, but I might not phrase it and say make an ethical decision phrase it in more common layman's terms about a scenario of where you may have had a conflict of interest or some sort of impropriety was happening or something, and then see how they might respond to that. Joe, do you have any comment about these questions?
Question number 2 might be more effective if you ask them to define unethical behavior and maybe say, what would you do in response to somebody else acting unethically? Like, would they intervene or would they confront the person?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so there's 3 more questions that our chat bot wanted to suggested, and let's move on to them. So 3, have you ever witnessed unethical behavior in the workplace? And if so, how did you handle the situation? So here is not just yourself, but now you're seeing it in your workplace in general. So how about that one? Does it twist it a little bit differently and make it better, or is it still the same kind of problems?
I think it's Joe for the win on slide 18.
I like that question better than number 2.
Yeah. I think
Okay.
it's interesting. I think that especially in courts of limited jurisdiction, we certainly do ask, we don't specifically ask, how do you handle conflicts of interest, but we do ask, what do you think the appropriate actions that should be taken if someone came before you in court that you knew? You had a personal relationship with. What do you think should happen? What do you think the appropriate course of action would be? Because it's far more likely to happen at a limited jurisdiction level where more common violations take place. But I think 4 is interesting, and I think we've had people answer across the gamut. Like, I wouldn't want to deal with that case. And I think that answer says a lot. Or we've had people like, well, it's my job to be fair, so I would just treat it like any other case. And it's like, well, so I think, again, that those responses tell you a lot. We've also gone different things of providing them with a copy of our code of conduct prior to actually interviewing. So, but I like number 4.
I think number 4 might be better if you ask the person, what are some potential conflicts of interest that you might encounter as a court employee, as opposed to just asking them a general question about conflicts of interest.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion, Joe.
I think with the question number 3 and the experiences that I've had dealing with areas around that, most people in an interview immediately go to criminal behavior. If you witnessed unethical behavior, basically they think, okay, have I ever witnessed criminal behavior? Somebody taking $5 bills out of the envelope for the parking, processing parking tickets and sticking it in their pocket. When it's beyond clearly criminal behavior, then it gets a little bit more gray area as to one person's definition of criminal behavior, or rather unethical behavior versus another.
How about number 5? Can you give an example of a time when you had to speak up or take a stand on an ethical issue, even if it was difficult or unpopular? You have the courage to do that. Do you think you'll get an honest answer, or what kind of response do you think we might get from people who, in an interview situation?
Are you asking me if I'm a narc? Like, are you? I just.
I'm asking everybody, all of you.
Yeah,
what do you think?
That's just what is. I don't know.
It's getting to one of those.
I kind of feel like that's a trick question, because if they say no, then it's like, well, did you work in like La La Land, or I don't. I think we've all kind of seen things that have seemed somewhat sketchy, but yeah, I don't know.
The most obvious answer, which I have certainly seen in interviews I've done, that is unique to the courts, is court employees must be impartial and unbiased. Clearly, even in the face and of the possession of information which they have, which could tip the balance of the process one way or the other. I can't tell you about how to fill out these forms because I'm not an attorney. I have to remain impartial and unbiased. This is a very common question you get right at the counter. I'm not asking you for legal advice. I'm asking you how to fill out this form, because the general public doesn't understand what legal advice is and doesn't understand the prohibition against legal advice. And again, a savvy job candidate would certainly go back to that. And I think most of us have, at one time or another in our careers, have been faced with that specific issue. And some of us have even been cussed out for not being able to, not agreeing to provide that information.
Again, one thing I think that it's used, the word ethical issue in the interview, for somebody, as Courtney said earlier, is coming in from the outside, it might be hard for them to pinpoint something there. Maybe if you changed it to, a problem that occurred in your workplace or something like that, to be more generic term might help. I don't know. Again, we sort of get back to, we're trying to accomplish here with these sorts of questions, both the ones that from the book that we dealt with earlier, or now from ChatGPT. We're trying to find out whether or not this person in front of us in an interview scenario has, the attributes, the personal qualities, and high character, are they a person of high character who we can expect to be an ethical employee? And it's a difficult thing. As we're discovering going through all this stuff.
Huh.
All right. So I did this as an exercise, not only to just get a different source of maybe questions to ask in an interview setting, and besides the book that we used last month and a little bit here, the Good Ones book, but I also thought it would be informative because there's so much going on right now in everywhere, tech industry, the companies, the news media, whatever, about ChatGPT and how it's being used or could be used, the problems with it. And I thought it'd be informative for us to take a dive into it and say, okay, what can it be helpful even in something like this? And and so the purpose wasn't to get us into a long discussion about the value or the end of humanity as we know it because of ChatGPT. Our robot overlords are about to take over, but I just thought it'd be a good now. But there is the ChatGPT after these 5 questions came up with this. So asking this is ChatGPT's. It's text. Is it finished answering my question? Asking these types of questions can give you insight into a candidate's values and how they approach ethical dilemmas. It's important to remember that the candidate's responses to these questions should be just one part of your evaluation process. It's also a good idea to ask for references and to speak with previous supervisors to get a more well-rounded understanding of the candidate's ethical behavior. That's kind of a nice summation in a lot of ways, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I think it points out that ChatGPT is actually a pretty nifty tool. I think, but also as we've learned, you have to use it wisely and put it into context and use it. It is a tool there. It references. It's also a good idea to ask for references. And so I think we're done because of time and whatever. We've gone through a lot of time on kind of questions to ask in an interview. We previously had talked about, what to do leading up to an interview to attract people. But then the last piece of it is references and background checks and such. What might you ask prior employers and other references? And then I put in there, how do you get around HR who's going to have a hissy fit for asking questions like this? At least that's my opinion. And I'm not speaking for NACM here. That's a Norman's personal opinion. In fact, our whole thing is just us talking. What kind of references and background checks do you do, and could you do to try to ferret out whether or not this is going to be an ethical employee? That's the topic of du jour of what we're trying to deal with here.
I think the financial history, I would say, would be off the table. I don't think that I think that's too invasive. Criminal history we do check, but I'm curious about my colleagues on here on their thoughts on references, because I feel like when you ask for a list of references, of course you have the people that differentiate between personal or professional, and I don't really want to know what your mom's, like your BFF mom, thinks of you as a person. I don't think I'm getting much for that. We do certainly ask, talk to prior employers, especially like if they're a transfer here within the county. I have no problem calling their supervisor and saying, hey, what's going on? But the bottom line is that they are they themselves as the company are very limited on what they can say. Yes, this person worked here. No, this person didn't work here. And, you know, unless you're in with the, you know, the HR lingo code, you don't really know. I mean, they can't tell you too much. So I'm curious on what everybody else does with references.
Stacy, what do you do up there in Alaska?
I have
You
a
have
similar
backup-
experience. Yeah, I have a similar experience to you, Courtney, is you mostly get the rote answers. So references aren't as helpful to me as letters of recommendation.
Mhm.
And as you said, depending on the source of the letter.
Yeah.
Yeah, in my experience, yeah, we would, if we had a final candidate, we would do our due diligence and a means of contacting prior employers. And one thing that we did was basically I would have my HR representative do with a fairly stock set of questions that we had, you know, vetted what we wanted to ask, that we didn't get into legal trouble, whatever. And you're going to get the boilerplate responses the vast majority of the time, although sometimes people open up and tell you things. So that was a standard thing. Criminal history, you know, I worked in the federal courts, and that's just a lock stock standard thing. I mean, you do a criminal background check to see what the criminal history is. And then, of course, then you have to evaluate whether or not it's relevant. If you find something, is it relevant to the position? And that's the key thing in my mind, is when you're doing this sort of thing, you know, did they have a minor misdemeanor back when they're in college? They're now 40 something years old, and there's been nothing ever since. And it has no relevance to the job, really. You know, who cares? On the other hand, if it was, you know, they murdered somebody, you know, 6 years ago or whatever, and they're on probation right now, maybe depends on the circumstances. Financial history, since I'm talking financial history, yeah. Go ahead.
Would a felony conviction be a automatic bar in the federal system?
No. Again, we would do an evaluation of what it was, when it was, and is it relevant to the position being hired for? Which leads me to the financial history piece. We would not do a financial history on every single employee that we hired, but if I was hiring somebody to be my financial administrator, who did the accounting, it was in charge of all the accounting and financial affairs of the court, we would run a financial history on them and see if they were having some sort of history there that might give us red flags about how they handled money.
Well, I think if someone did a financial history on me, I think that would be almost comical. Like, oh, when was the last time you balanced your checkbook? I don't know, somewhere around the mid-90s. I mean, I may be, you know, great at reconciling the bank statements for the court and keeping track of bonds and doing all of those things. But if you look at my financial history, yeah, my credit is fantastic, but I have no idea what is cleared and what has not cleared. So I think that would be difficult, but I like the way that you put it to where it would be directly related to the job being applied for. And I think the other thing that I'm not seeing on here, but is that little box when they're going through their employment history that says, may we contact? And they have to say yes or no. And I always find it very interesting when they say no. And then it's, you know, why did you leave? Oh, we had creative differences. No, that's not even a real thing. So I don't, I need to know more words on that. And there are things not too long ago, we called a former employer, and, you know, I always make sure that the last question that we ask is there anything else that you would like us to know? And the response was yes, but we are not allowed to talk about that. Okay, great. Okay, great.
Right.
Good talk. But yeah, I think some of the other things just on the application alone, I think that certainly raises some, let's talk more about that. I mean, if the business is no longer a business anymore, then I get it, but yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's also, it's important to disclose up front to applicants what you may or may not check. in the way of this, in this area. And so once again, like in the federal court, we tell people just up front, we are going to do, you know, at some point we may do a criminal history check on you, and we may do, you know, other checks such as a financial history check. You know, so you disclose it up front so that there's no surprises, and they go, "What? You did that? I didn't expect you to do that," you know, or whatever. No, I mean, if you want this job, this is what our screening process are, and you're upfront and you're transparent about it.
I have one.
But again, it better be relevant.
Yeah, I have one more question as far as relevance. So, drug testing. When you guys send people out for drug testing now here in the great state of Missouri, through a constitutional change, recreational marijuana is open for everyone now over the age of 21. And so you send somebody for a drug test and it comes back that they have tested positive for THC. You know, what is that conversation that you have? Like, you can't do that while you're at work, and it kind of opens up like a whole host of other things. Do you disclose that on the drug test it showed that they were positive for THC, or, you know, what are the limits there, and how are we handling drug tests while we're talking about criminal history checks and financial history checks, and there's also, you know, drug checks.
Right.
I mean, would testing positive for THC be a bar to employment?
No, not up and until if you were stoned at work and fell asleep and hit your head on the desk, and now you have an injury at work and you go and
Okay.
test positive for THC, then there's, you know, a whole
Yeah.
host of other things that could potentially happen. But
There's another question I had for you, Courtney, that you mentioned about doing reference checks. And that last question would be, you know, is there anything else you want to tell me, but I can't because I'm barred from responding to that, which is code, basically. Or the other question was, would you hire this employee again? No, I'm not going to ask you why, but I mean, so, I mean, there's this code. How ethical is it for us to be doing these workarounds and creating this interesting background check coding system, which we all seem to know about?
Good question, Peter.
And by the way, the candidate does,
Are we being ethical?
yeah, I mean, does the candidate have any opportunity to respond to that sort of thing? Often not. I mean,
Yeah, it's a coercive environment,
yeah,
you know.
the power differential in a job interview or a job application process is so unbalanced and so skewed. We never talk
Yeah.
about that, you know, all of the power rests with the employer, and we often can do things which are shady.
Okay.
I thought that your topic about the, you know, the power differential, I am always impressed by any applicant that ends the interview with, you know, usually that person that's doing the interviewing at the end will say, do you have any more questions for me? And a lot of times they're like, no, none of them I can think of right now. But if that person that comes back and says, is there any reason that I have given you that you're not going to offer me this position? And I'm like, wow. Okay.
Really?
I like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good
I think
response.
it flips it,
Okay.
so.
All right. I'm gonna have to call time here and move on. We're getting to the end of it there. So I had on here just what other actions might be effective to screen candidates for ethical qualities. We've talked about on the front end, job descriptions, your recruitment materials, reaching out to the community to make sure you have a wide based thing. Then we all the ethical, the questions, and then we just had the background checks. Is there anything else that we haven't brought up that, you know, if you're trying to hire an ethical employee, or did we miss something?
Gladiator games, naturally.
Trial by combat.
Okay, and on that high note, I'm just gonna say, okay, so now I'm just posing this to us as the ethics committee of NACM. Is there anything else I do to follow up on today's discussion and the discussion last month and this month? You know, is there something else that we should talk about in the future, or some way to, you know, for example, we could leverage this into a presentation and discussion at an annual conference, in an educational session, you know, just hint. The conference development committee might like to get a proposal from our committee to do this sort of discussion at a conference, and do a presentation about how do you hire an ethical employee, or can you? Can you effectively screen for that? So, what do you think about that idea, for down the road?
I like it. Challenge accepted. I think it's a good one. I think it's very interesting. I like Peter's. Peter, you may be on the hook for April. I really like it, the point about the power differential and how you address that from our end.
Okay, well, I think we can follow up this in terms of follow up on today's discussion last month, and we're at our next meeting maybe as a regular agenda item for the committee. But in the interest of time, again, this is the cover of the book that I've referred to, for a lot of our discussion, The Good Ones: 10 Crucial Qualities of High Character Employees. I recommend it. I mean, I don't agree, and I think we haven't agreed with a lot of the stuff that he may be proposing, but it does make you think a lot about, well, you want high character employees. And so how do you screen for them? And this book is really on point. So it's an excellent resource. There's the list for it. And then that's it. There's a beautiful picture of where I live. That's out my window in Albuquerque in the Sandia Mountains.
Wow.
And we're done.
Perfect.
Thanks for joining us today. A Question of Ethics Conversation is a regular segment on ethics, courts, and court administration. Today's episode will be available on our website, in the Court Manager Journal, on the Court Leader website, on YouTube, Facebook, iTunes, LinkedIn, and on Twitter. Become part of the conversation. If you have questions, comments, or ideas for future episodes, email us. Our address is ethics@nacomnet.org. Did you hear an interesting comment by one of the panelists that you'd like to listen to again, but you don't want to search the entire episode to find it? The Additional Resources section on the web page contains a question time marker sheet. Just find the discussion question on the sheet, and next to it was the time that question was asked. You can then quickly fast forward to that time on the episode and listen to the panelists' comments. Remember, if you don't have time to watch an episode, you can always listen to the audio version. Listen in your car or on the bus on your way to or from work. You never have to miss an episode. I'm Pete Kiefer, and on behalf of our guests, the Court Leader website, and the National Association for Court Management, thank you, and have a great day. The views, information, and opinions expressed during this episode are solely those of the host and the individual presenters. They do not necessarily represent the position of the National Association for Court Management.